Snow clung to the pines like a shroud, and the cold in the town of Redemption had a bite that went straight to the bone. Finn walked its one muddy street, a giant of a man, insulated by muscle and a thick beard frosted with his own breath. He was down from his mountain claim for salt, flour, and coffee, necessities to see him through the deep winter. He kept his eyes down, accustomed to the way townsfolk stared at his size, his long, wild hair, and the solitude that seemed to hang on him like his heavy coat. But a knot of men gathered near the saloon drew his gaze. Their laughter was cruel, sharp-edged. In their center stood a smaller man, all swagger and cheap wool, and beside him a figure so still she might have been a statue. She was small, dressed in a red silk cheongsam that was a slash of impossible color against the gray day. A thick gray hood obscured her face entirely, shadowing her from chin to brow. A crude sign was nailed to the post behind her. Chinese bride, hard worker, $5. The man, a failed prospector Finn recognized as Barker, was gesturing at her. "Guaranteed obedient. Won't say a word. $5 and she's yours. Cheaper than a mule and twice as useful." The men laughed again. Finn felt something cold and hard settle in his gut. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was a familiar ache, the recognition of a creature cornered and alone. He had seen it in wolf pups left by the pack, in deer caught in a rock slide. He was a man who lived by a simple, quiet code carved into him by the unforgiving wilderness. You did not let a living thing suffer needlessly under your watch. The woman, though hidden, was trembling. He could see the faint tremor in her hands, which were clasped tightly at her waist. He thought of his cabin, silent and empty. He thought of the coming months of utter isolation. He was lonely, a truth he rarely admitted even to himself. This was a transaction of desperation, both hers and his own. He took a step forward, his large frame parting the crowd without effort. The men fell silent, turning to look at the mountain man. Barker's greasy smile faltered. Finn didn't speak. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt, his movements deliberate, and pulled out a silver dollar, then another, and another, until 5 heavy coins lay in his calloused palm. He held them out. Barker's eyes widened with greed. He snatched the coins. "She's all yours, friend." Finn's gaze moved to the hooded figure. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of command. She flinched, but then straightened her small back and took a hesitant step toward him. He turned without a word and started walking toward the edge of town, toward the steep trail that led up into the silent, white world that was his home. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He could hear her soft, shuffling steps in the thin layer of snow behind him, a quiet, persistent echo of the decision he had just made. The climb was brutal. The trail, little more than a goat path, grew steep and treacherous as it wound its way up the mountain. The air thinned, and the snow began to fall in earnest, thick, wet flakes that melted on his beard and clung to her gray hood. Finn moved with an easy, powerful rhythm, his long legs eating up the ground, his huge body a bulwark against the rising wind. He was aware of her behind him, a small, determined presence. She never stumbled, never fell behind. He paused on a ledge to catch his breath, turning to look at her for the first time since leaving town. The hood still concealed her face, but he could see the steady rise and fall of her chest. She wasn't winded. He saw a surprising strength in her posture, a resilience that the men in town had failed to see. He grunted, pulling a strip of dried venison from his pack. He held it out to her. She looked at the offering, then at his outstretched hand, and gave a small, sharp shake of her head. He held it there a moment longer, then shrugged and put it away. He understood. Trust was not bought with $5, and it certainly wasn't earned with a single gesture. It had to be built, stone by quiet stone. He turned and continued the climb. The silence between them was vast, broken only by the crunch of their boots in the snow and the mournful sigh of the wind through the pines. He wondered what horrors had led her to this point, to be sold for the price of a few provisions. He wondered what she thought of him, this giant who had bought her like livestock. He felt a deep, unfamiliar shame settle over him, heavy as the pack on his back. This was wrong. But leaving her to the mercy of a man like Barker felt like a greater wrong. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was a dark shape against the swirling snow. It was small, built of thick, hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke. It was a fortress against the wilderness, a place of warmth and solitude. He pushed open the heavy plank door and stepped inside, moving aside to let her pass. She hesitated on the threshold, a small figure poised between the raging storm outside and the unknown shelter within. He didn't rush her. He simply waited, his presence filling the doorway. After a long moment, she ducked her head and slipped past him into the dim interior. The cabin was one room, dominated by a large stone hearth where embers glowed. It was spare but meticulously clean. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed piled with furs was built into one corner, and shelves holding neatly stacked tins and jars lined the wall. Finn moved to the hearth, adding logs from the wood box until a proper fire roared to life, chasing the chill from the room. He didn't look at her, giving her space to absorb her new surroundings. He could feel her standing by the door, a tense, silent observer. He gestured toward a small alcove, separated from the main room by a heavy blanket hung as a curtain. "That is yours," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. Inside the alcove was a small cot with a clean mattress ticking and a folded quilt. It was a space of her own, a promise of privacy. She gave a small, stiff nod. He turned his attention to the fire, slinging a pot over the flames and adding water from a bucket, then chunks of salted pork and dried vegetables. He worked with an economy of motion, his large hands surprisingly deft. He was a man accustomed to taking care of himself. They ate the simple stew in silence, sitting on opposite sides of the table. She kept her hood on, eating with small, precise movements, her head bowed. He ate slowly, his gaze fixed on the fire. When they were done, he took the bowls to the wash basin. He laid out his own bedroll of furs on the floor in front of the hearth, placing himself between her alcove and the main door. It was a clear, unspoken statement. You are protected. He would be the barrier against the world. He lay down without another word, turning his back to her, and listened to the storm howl outside. Soon he heard the faint rustle as she retreated behind the blanket into her own small sanctuary. The days fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Finn rose before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to disturb her. He would tend the fire, then head out to check his trap lines or chop wood, his axe strokes echoing in the frozen air. He was a creature of the mountain, his strength a practical thing used for survival, not for show. When he returned, the cabin would be warm, the floor swept clean. She was a ghost in his home, her presence marked by small transformative acts. His worn shirt would be on his chair, a split seam mended with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. The meager rations were stretched into flavorful broths. She was impossibly competent, her hands always busy. Yet she remained shrouded, both by the gray hood she never removed and by her profound silence. She moved around him with a cautious grace, a small planet in a careful orbit around a much larger one. He found himself talking to her, or rather, at her. He'd point out a hawk circling high above the pines. "That's a red-tail," he'd murmur. "She's hunting." He'd describe the way the snowdrifts formed against the northern wall of the cabin. "The wind comes down from Gray Peak." He expected no reply, and received none. He was simply filling the silence, trying to build a bridge of sound across the chasm of their circumstance. One afternoon, he found her by the window, her back to him. She was holding a tiny sparrow in her cupped hands. He saw that she had fashioned a minuscule splint for its broken wing from a twig and a thread pulled from her own red dress. Her touch was infinitely gentle, her focus absolute. In that moment, he saw past the hood, past the silence. He saw a capacity for care that mirrored the deep, buried well of it inside himself. It was a kindness that had been given no place to grow. He left her to her work, a strange warmth spreading through his chest. What stories are you holding on to that you think no one would understand? Down in Redemption, Mr. Abernathy, the general store proprietor, swept the boardwalk in front of his shop. He watched Barker stumbling out of the saloon, bragging to his cronies. "That big ox paid $5 for her," Barker slurred, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Should have asked for 10. Bet she's warming his bed right now." Abernathy frowned, the words leaving a sour taste in his mouth. He remembered the mountain man's eyes. They weren't cruel. They were quiet, steady, and held a deep-seated loneliness. He had seen the way Finn had looked at the hooded girl, not with lust, but with a kind of solemn responsibility. Abernathy had a feeling Barker didn't understand the man he'd sold a life to. Not at all. A blizzard descended upon the mountain, a howling white fury that erased the world. For 3 days they were sealed inside the cabin, the wind shrieking like a banshee against the logs. The enforced proximity was a heavy blanket, suffocating the air between them. The silence, once a neutral space, now felt charged with unspoken questions. On the 3rd night, the storm finally began to relent, its rage softening to a mournful whisper. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows. Finn sat at the table, methodically oiling the metal parts of a trap, the familiar task a balm to his restless energy. He could feel her watching him from her seat near the fire. He didn't look up, but he spoke into the quiet room, his voice low and even. "You don't need to be afraid here." He paused, setting a spring gently on the oiled cloth. "This world, it breaks things. People, too." He finally lifted his gaze, not to her, but to the flames. "I had a wife, a son. Fever took 'em both one winter, back in the valley. There was nothing I could do, nothing my strength could fix." He fell silent, the admission hanging in the air, a raw, exposed nerve. "That's why I came up here. The quiet is honest." He was offering her a piece of his own brokenness, a shard of his past. It was the truest thing he could give her. He saw movement from the corner of his eye. Slowly she raised her hands to her head. Her fingers trembled as they found the edge of the gray hood. With a quiet intake of breath, she pulled it back. Her hair was a cascade of polished black silk falling over her shoulders. Her face, illuminated by the firelight, was heart-stoppingly beautiful. And down the left side, from her temple to the delicate line of her jaw, ran a pale silver scar. It was not grotesque, but it was undeniable, a permanent mark on her otherwise flawless skin. She lifted her chin, her dark eyes meeting his, filled with a mixture of terror and defiance. She was showing him the reason for her shame, the wound she had kept hidden from the world. Finn looked at her, at the scar that cut a path across her cheek. He saw the story of pain written there. He saw the vulnerability in her gaze. He felt the immense courage it took for her to reveal it. His expression did not change. There was no flicker of shock, no recoil of pity, no hint of disgust. He simply held her gaze, his own eyes clear and steady. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement and turned back to his work, his hands moving with the same calm purpose as before. He had seen her truth, and he had not looked away. The next morning the world was a clean white slate, the blizzard having passed. The silence in the cabin was different. It was lighter, no longer heavy with secrets. She moved about her morning tasks without the hood, her face open to the light filtering through the small window. The scar was just a part of her, like the color of her eyes or the shape of her hands. Finn's acceptance had been a quiet miracle, a balm on a wound she thought would never heal. He came inside after checking the perimeter of the cabin, stamping thick snow from his boots. The cold clung to him, and his beard was laced with ice. He was exhausted, the long days of the storm having taken their toll. He set a brace of rabbits on the table, his contribution to their survival. He turned, and she was standing there, not by the fire, but in the center of the room, waiting for him. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and her gaze was direct. For the first time, she spoke. Her voice was soft, husky from disuse, the words heavily accented but clear. "My name is An." He stopped, his whole body going still. He had waited weeks to hear her voice, had almost come to believe he never would. He waited for more, but she fell silent, as if that single declaration had taken all her strength. He managed a nod, his throat suddenly tight. Then she took a small step closer, her eyes holding his. "Thank you," she whispered, the words fragile in the quiet air. "For the safety." It was so simple. Not a plea, not a demand, not a story of her pain. It was an acknowledgement. She had seen his intent, the core of his actions from the very first moment he'd laid down those $5 silver. She had seen past his rough exterior, his size, his isolation, and understood the truth of him. He was a protector. The words pierced through the thick wall he had built around his heart for years. The grief for his lost family, the profound loneliness of his existence, the quiet shame of the transaction that had brought her here, it all swelled up inside him at once. He was overwhelmed by the raw, staggering relief of being truly seen by another soul. He had to turn away, facing the fire, his broad shoulders shaking with a single, silent sob. He scrubbed a hand over his face, but Anne saw the tear that cut a clean path through the grime and weariness on his cheek. He wasn't crying for his past. He was crying for a future he hadn't known he could have. After that, everything changed. The silence in the cabin became a comfortable quiet, punctuated now by conversation. He learned her name was Anne, and she learned his was Finn. In halting English, she told him her story. She had been promised to a wealthy merchant in San Francisco, her family in China hoping for a better life for her. But a fire on the ship had scarred her, and when the merchant saw her face, he had refused her, casting her out. Barker, a man who preyed on the desperate, had taken her in, seeing only an opportunity for profit. Finn listened without interruption, his quiet presence a safe harbor for her painful memories. He, in turn, told her more about his life on the mountain, about the names of the constellations he could see from his doorway, about the way the seasons turned the valley below from green to gold to white. A gentle, fragile intimacy began to bloom between them, nurtured by shared meals and quiet conversations by the fire. He saw her smile for the first time when a clumsy squirrel dropped a pine cone on his head, and the sound was like a forgotten music. Down in Redemption, Barker's luck had run out. The $5 were long gone, spent on whiskey and cards. His resentment toward Finn festered, fueled by greed and humiliation. A rumor began to circulate, whispered in the saloon, that the mountain man wasn't just a trapper, that his isolated claim was sitting on a rich vein of silver. Barker seized on the rumor, his mind twisting it into a certainty. He'd been cheated. The trapper had known about the silver all along. And the girl, she must know where it was. He convinced himself that she wasn't a wife, but property he had a right to reclaim, along with the fortune he believed was his. He gathered 2 other men, as desperate and morally bankrupt as himself, and they rode out of town, their faces set with grim purpose, heading up the snowy trail to Finn's cabin. The sound of their horses arrived before they did, a harsh intrusion into the mountain's peace. Finn was splitting logs when he heard it. He straightened, axe in hand, his body instantly alert. Anir appeared in the cabin doorway, her face pale with alarm. She was not wearing her hood. Down the trail, 3 figures emerged from the trees. Barker was in the lead, his face a mask of smug entitlement. "I've come for what's mine, trapper," he yelled, his voice thin and sharp in the cold air. "My property." Finn said nothing. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable wall of a man, the axe held loosely at his side. He was not threatening, yet his very presence was a threat. Ann stepped out onto the small porch behind him, her fear warring with a new, unfamiliar strength. Barker's eyes fell on her, and he sneered, pointing a grimy finger. "There she is. Still damaged goods, I see. But you owe me for her upkeep, and for the silver you're hiding." Finn's voice, when it came, was a low growl that seemed to vibrate in the very air. "She is not goods. She is my wife. This is her home." He took a half step forward. "Leave." Barker laughed, a high, nervous sound. "I don't think so. We're coming in." But as his men started to dismount, Ann did something unexpected. She moved to Finn's side and placed a small, steady hand on his massive forearm. It was a simple gesture, but it was a declaration. It was a public claiming of him, a mirroring of his quiet protection of her. It said, "We are one." "You will do no such thing," a new voice called out, firm and clear. 2 more figures appeared on the trail, Mr. Abernathy, his face grim with concern, and the town sheriff. The storekeeper, having seen Barker and his cronies ride out, had feared the worst and sought help. The sheriff leveled a stern gaze at Barker. "The transaction was legal, Barker. You were paid. What you're doing now is threatening a man's family on his own land. I suggest you and your friends turn around before I'm forced to arrest you." Barker's face turned purple with rage and humiliation. He was exposed, his greed and cruelty laid bare for all to see. Under the sheriff's unwavering stare, his bluster collapsed. He spat on the snow, muttered a curse, and wrenched his horse around, riding away in a storm of impotent fury, his cronies trailing behind him like dogs. The threat was gone. The quiet of the mountain settled back around the cabin, broken only by the soft whisper of the wind. Mr. Abernathy gave Finn a respectful nod. "Glad we got here in time." Finn simply nodded back, his gratitude too deep for words. When they were gone, he and Ann were left alone in the vast white stillness. He turned to look at her, his hand covering hers where it still rested on his arm. In her eyes he saw not fear, but a fierce, unwavering trust. He had been her shield, and she, in her own quiet way, had been his. They had faced the world together and won. That night, the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken emotion. After their meal, Finn did not lay his bedroll by the hearth. Instead, he carried the heavy furs and placed them on the floor beside the cot in her alcove. It was a question, an offering of closeness without demand, a gesture of profound tenderness. He lay down, the space between them small but respectful. For a long time there was only the sound of the fire and their breathing. Then, from the cot above him, her hand reached down. He took it, her small, delicate fingers lacing with his large, calloused ones. He lay there on his back, holding her hand, watching the firelight play across the rough-hewn ceiling. She did not retreat behind her blanket curtain. Later she shifted, moving from her cot to sit on the floor beside him, her back resting against his side. He felt the light pressure of her head settling against his shoulder. A sense of peace, so deep and complete it was almost painful, washed over him. He had bought a wife for $5, a silent, hooded stranger. But in the heart of the unforgiving winter, through quiet acts of care and a fierce, unspoken decency, they had built a home. Here, in the shelter of the mountain, two lonely, wounded souls had found not just safety, but family.